started, I think Chris said she wasn't going to be able to make the beginning of the meeting. She may try to get the back half on it. So so we'll get things going. We'll call to order this meeting of the Fiscal Policy Work Group. Today's June 5th, 2020 at around 10 o'clock in the morning. And as we get started per our remote meeting protocol, we'll go ahead and do a roll call. So Dave Luno reporting from Hopkinton. Let's see, Dick Ames.
Dick Ames from Jaffrey, and I'm alone here.
And John Beardmore.
John Beardmore in Hopkinton, also with the door closed, not alone in the house, but hopefully alone in the room.
All right. Mary Heath.
Mary Heath here in Manchester, and my husband's at the grocery store.
Okay. And Rick Ladd.
Rick Ladd is here in Haverhill, alone with my Cocker Spaniel.
Ooh. So, and we've got Jordan Hensley.
Yeah, Jordan Hensley here in Dover. My fiance's in the other room, but just me here.
Okay, and Jen 4.
Jen 4 here in Concord, home alone.
All righty. So we got our team here. Jordan, how's it look as far as our tech for today?
Looks like we're all good. Smooth sailing, hopefully.
Okay, and we've got some attendees. We've got looks like 5 attendees tuned in. So so thank you all very much for taking the time out of a June Friday morning. We've got a couple things on the docket for today. The biggest ones really being hearing from Rick and from Dick on the work that they've done on tasks 1 and 2. And Jordan, I think you have do you have the documents that they've produced? And we reviewed them yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And Rick, I'm sorry you weren't able to make it, but we reviewed yours too. So I mean, that we should be in good shape to sort of go through this walkthrough of what you've found and take questions from the work group members and see what additional work we need to do on those tasks. And you know, keeping those, you know, what we're learning in tasks 1 and 2, also what things we may want to you know look at as we approach task 3, or maybe we approach even some of the other things that tasks 1 and 2 might help to you know, shed some light on. So so anyway, let's start with task 1, which Rick was taking care of. And task 1 reads, identify all current revenue sources, local, state, federal, and grants for pre-K-12 education in New Hampshire. So Rick, can I just sort of turn it over to you, and you can ask Jordan anything you want to have put up on the screen.
Yeah, do we have the sheets which I've, you know, sent to everybody? I don't know if everybody has them available, because if we're going to look at this, we need to be looking at the sheets as well at the same time.
Yeah, and Jordan can put them up on the screen. He's got them all. We did that yesterday, and I think Jordan actually they're online, and we emailed links to all that stuff to all the work group members.
Yeah, there were quite a few files, so I directed folks to our resource website, but all the files should be there, and I'm happy to put anything on the screen that you'd like, Rick.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start with the first one right here, which is the sheet from the Department of Education budget appropriation amounts for FY10 through FY19. I think that sheet just simply is good from the standpoint, it helps explain what funds come from the state and the various sources of those funds.
Actually, Rick.
Yeah.
Rick, one of the other, you know, when we looked at them yesterday, and I know you had an appointment.
I was getting cortisone in my shoulder.
Well, I hope it's feeling good now.
It's much better today.
Um, we actually started with the there was a real high level sheet that basically showed revenue sources for the general and ETF. Yeah, this one right here.
Okay, let me get that.
And you had some notes down at the bottom.
Yeah, that's a sheet in which I tried to summarize where on the state level the majority of the money comes from. And you can see it comes from the business tax as the majority, and the statewide education property tax and meals and room. And then that gets smaller taxes as you go on down.
Right, right.
and
And this is this is basically everything coming into the state, the $2.6 billion of revenue. Obviously, most of that is for the general fund. Some of that is for the education trust fund.
Yeah, and it's
No.
interesting to note on this. You know, I've always had problems with the SWEPT as far as, is that a state tax or a local tax? And, you know, it says it's a statewide education property tax, but it certainly never gets to the state. And so I think that's a tax right there that we have to really grapple with, that $363 million.
Well, I agree with that. You know, I'd like to make an observation that I think fits in and relates to all of these taxes, these sources of revenue, and what we have down here as numbers for fiscal year 20. And I hadn't brought this up before, but the reason I wasn't at your meeting, at the meeting of the commission when was it? This Monday, was because I was with Ways and Means estimating revenues for fiscal year 20. And it's a really sobering reality we're looking at. So you're looking here at business taxes at $795 million for fiscal year 20. The Ways and Means Committee estimated that at most we expect to receive in 20 $716 million, and we could be as low as $650 million. Big difference.
Mm-hmm.
And in 21, for the next fiscal year, instead of the expected somewhat reduced $786 million, that's not shown here, but that's what we expected, and that's what we budgeted for as a state. We have a worst case of $655 million and a best case of 577. The other way around, 577 is the worst case, 655 is the best case. So we're facing big losses, which relates, I think, as we think about sources of revenue for education, to the question of volatility. You need to bear that in mind, that things happen in the economic world that these taxes draw upon that can dramatically change the money coming in. And the next tax line here is the state property tax. Well, we estimate $363 million for fiscal year 20, just as we estimated that and put it into the budget when we did the budget way back when. It doesn't change, and that's kind of an oddity. Even though we know that municipalities that collect this revenue expect to collect less because property taxpayers will be in difficult circumstances for one reason or another. They're likely not to pay their bill on time whenever it's due, but probably by July 1. Yet the state expects no lessening of the money that it receives, basically because that's a bill that the town pays to the school districts. It's essentially moved on from the municipalities to the school districts without any adjustment, which in turn means that the other programs that the municipality has have to grapple with the reality that the total revenues that have come in to the municipality are less. So that's an interesting difference. I could go through meals and rooms tax too is dramatically down. That's unusual in, speaking of volatility, that's a tax. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's unusual it's going down so far because, of course, of the nature of this COVID virus that has caused the closure of the facilities, the activities that generate this tax. So I just wanted to chime in on that and provide that as context for us as we go forward.
Dick, I think those are some great observations there, and one of the reasons, Rick, I wanted to start with this chart is because of the timeliness with the Ways and Means revised revenue estimates, and I was wondering if maybe either Ways and Means or maybe Dick, if it's something you could create, would be a spreadsheet that sort of looks like this with the FY20 and FY21 budgeted amounts, and then the FY20, FY21 adjusted from May from your meeting earlier this week.
Yeah, I can do that.
Meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would really help.
Yeah, I can
Rick?
absolutely.
I agree with you. I think that would really help. And, if Jordan would, I'd like to have him scroll this down to the bottom of that page, and right there where I put my note in, that is my biggest concern in terms of, of what we're doing right now. I agree with Dick that we're going to have a significant problem finding out where these dollars are come. Our economy wraps around restaurants and tourism, and that's being hammered.
Mm-hmm. Right. And another question too, Dick, when you were talking about the SWEPT and how the state or how Ways and Means did not adjust the SWEPT revenue, they kept it at 363
Can
million.
you go back up, Jordan?
Yeah. Can you scroll back up, Jordan?
Yeah, thank you.
And maybe this is a question for John. Is when a municipality collects property taxes and the components of those property taxes comprise the municipal tax, the local education tax, the county tax, and the SWEPT, is there a priority to those?
There is. Well, there is and there isn't. And perhaps we can get DRA back in to talk about how this works. As you might imagine, as commissioner, I didn't have the subject matter expertise in every area to the degree that the staff does. I often know just enough to be dangerous. But I guess a couple thoughts. One, as it relates to the state property tax, I know I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's a state tax. It's a state tax. It's a state tax. But to Rick Ladd's point in his bullet, do local taxpayers consider it a locally raised and retained tax, a local tax? Yes. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. It's just a unique circumstance of the way this tax is levied, raised, and spent. A better term than raised is probably administered. So I guess, it is unique in that I'm not aware. Well, that's not true. It's set at a rate to raise a dollar specific amount. So that's why Ways and Means wouldn't touch it. And, you've got as I've said before, you've got the state property tax, at least 2 local property taxes, a town and a school, and a county property tax, all in the same bill. And I'll just use Hopkinton as an example because that's where I'm from. The tax collector in our town is going to commingle all of those tax levies on the same bill. We're going to pay it in 2 chunks, one in the summer, one in the winter. And included in that bill is what's known as an overlay. So you've got the budgeted amounts, you got the 363 million, you've got your school budget. We budget at the top level, and then we solve for the property tax. So we take our approved budget, assuming we're going to have one. We subtract our other assumed revenues, and then we raise an amount. Can somebody mute, please? There's a lot of feedback going on. We raise an amount to, we set a rate to raise the dollar amount. When those dollars come into the town clerk, that state law does direct when and how. And I think it might also have to do with agreements like with cooperative school districts and whatnot. But the timing of those payments is directed. And I know, for example, like at the county level, the counties get all their money, I want to say in January. So they're held harmless from any collection deficiencies.
Okay.
The overlay is supposed to correct for that. So the overlay is an amount that DRA allows the town to raise by property taxes over and above the sum of the warrant for the town, for the school district, for the state, for the county. And that overlay is basically protects against deficiency in the collection rate. So the town's going to assume a collection rate of, I bet New Hampshire towns are in the range of like 98% in a typical year. As Representative Ames said, this year it ain't going to be like that. It'll be interesting to see what the rates are. But the overlay also pays for like tax abatements. So if you think about it, like if I don't like the value of my property, which drives the value of my property tax bill, I go to the Board of Selectmen and I ask for an abatement. The selectmen, let's say, grant it. I'm getting refunded a portion of what I paid for my county tax, my school tax, my state tax. Yet when that abatement is paid, the town clerk does not go to the school department and does not go to the county and say, okay, I need a few bucks back because I paid John $300 because we adjusted his value. It doesn't work like that. It comes out of the overlay. So I guess that's trying to address the point that, in a time when we can expect collection rates to drop, what happens to that 363 million? I think the town government is left holding the bag, is basically the bottom line. And the school, for both its local levy and the state levy and the county, don't really participate in that pain. I may be off a little bit on the margins here and how I'm describing this, but that's generally how I understand that it works. But if I could also add it, it is a state tax. And that state tax, I'm sorry I had to jump off early last time. It was a great presentation by the attorney who's arguing the case in Conval. But as he noted, it used to be 660, and the rate was set in statute, and how much was raised would rise and fall with property values. And as I recall, in the early 2000s, when adequacy was new, the rate was set every 2 years. In the second year, you're going to raise a little bit different amount. Well, that might not be true. They might have frozen the valuation for both years such that the state warrant raised the same amount in each year. But nonetheless, if you set the rate in statute, you're going to rise and fall with property values. the $363 million number, as I recall, came in 2006, plus or minus, prior to the rewrite of the ed funding plan that resulted from Senator Estabrook's commission. Then Senator Ted Gatsas sponsored an education funding plan that passed in the late days of the session. It might have been 2005, 2006. I was an LBA staffer at the time. It's a little foggy, but a lot of people don't know probably these days, but Ted Gatsas was one of a handful of ed funding gurus, or at least people who were super interested in it back in the day and spent a lot of time with spreadsheets and was capable of really understanding how this stuff worked. Might be a guy worth talking to again as we move forward. But it was his idea to fix the amount that was raised and then have the rate float. So now DRA pins the rate annually based on the amount of the warrant, which is 363 million. We could choose to have a floating rate. I mean, to Representative Ladd's point, I think we ought to discuss, and I think we will, the statewide education property tax and its mechanics until we get to a proposal. Either leave it the way it is, or we can do one of a number of different things. We can float the rate, we can float the levy, we can have donor towns again, so-called. We can keep it the way it is. We could have the state collect it, although I think you'd have a hard time convincing me that that's a good idea. So those are my thoughts on the state property tax.
Great, thanks, John. Something I think we've been thinking about is, and we'll get it scheduled for a fiscal policy work group coming up soon, is sort of a SWEP day, where we learn about the history of SWEP and learn about, you know, what were the things that that caused it to come into being with the with as you say, you know, the fixed amount, and then changing to a with a fixed rate, and then you know, changing to a fixed amount, but also maybe some of the intervening legal actions, things like that, that may have precipitated some of those things. So I think we'll work on putting something together for that soon. That's a great idea, John.
I guess just one other point that I'd make as we talk about the state revenue framework. To your point, Representative Ladd, you know, revenues are cratering and the state's going to have to do something about that one way or the other. Education funding is, you know, it's a constitutional program. So historically, the legislature has not cut ed funding grant, adequacy grants in times of fiscal stress. You know, my understanding is some additional funds were added this year for differentiated aid, and perhaps, you know, those could be cut. But the education aid formula is continually appropriated from the Education Trust Fund. So it does not need a budgeted appropriation to be spent. Put another way, the legislature could pass a $6 billion annual budget like it does and include ed funding in the DOE budget, or the legislature could pretend it didn't have that $1 billion liability for ed funding, pass a $5 billion budget, and those dollars would still flow. The DOE would still have to make those payments to the school districts because state law, state statute, somewhere in RSA 198, the formula is continually appropriated to the department to be spent to school districts. So in order to cut ed funding, you cannot just cut the budget, you have to change the statute. So I don't believe the governor through executive action, well, the state of emergency changes things, but in normal times, I don't think the governor through executive order, which needs fiscal committee approval, could cut adequacy aid. You could zero out the adequacy line item in the state operating budget, and these amounts still have to be paid. I'd be very curious to see if the governor tries to unilaterally cut adequacy under his self-interpreted powers under the state of emergency, whether that's within the base formula or in any supplemental line item, who knows, but just thought I'd throw that out there.
Right, right. No, thanks, John. And I think a point you're making, and I think a point Dick was raising too, is subject to different revenue sources are, I guess, would have a different volatility margin or something like that, depending upon what the economic conditions were, and trying to understand what the volatility, or in the opposite way of looking at it, the stability, predictability, reliability of revenue sources for, as you point out, constitutionally required services. So public education would be, is probably something that as the fiscal policy group, continues its work and the commission continues its work, is a factor that probably needs to be considered.
Yeah, I think so. But I guess another way to put it is adequacy aid doesn't shoulder the burden, or has not for 20 years shouldered the burden of revenue volatility. Those dollars are spent whether the money comes in or not. And if you scroll down on this sheet, Jordan, I noticed down toward, is it this sheet? Oh no, it was a previous sheet, showed transfers to and from the Education Trust Fund between the general fund and the Education Trust Fund. I just saw this, I'm not making this up.
Yeah, I think that's where we're getting to next. So we could probably, Rick, is that where you want to go next?
You're muted.
Rick, you're muted. You're still muted.
Dave, I think you can unmute him as the host.
No, I'm not a driver here.
I unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no.
No?
Yeah. That's good.
Technology, we love it. Yeah, one thing that, of course, I think there is stability in the property in the business tax. It's just that COVID has just put a shot in it, because our state is really oriented around restaurants and dining out and tourism. But the other sheet that I wanted to just take a real brief look at is the one I got from Caitlin several days ago regarding our federal dollars. And our federal dollars are decreasing. And when you look at the dollars available for elementary, secondary level programs, that's where I'm looking at, because these federal dollars also take care of post-secondary education and Pell Grants and all that. But when you look at the top side, it's just the Elementary Secondary Education Act stuff. And that's not the one. Let's see, is that it? Yeah.
I think so.
You see, that's where it's highlighted there. And you go across, and I believe it goes across to the point where we're down about what, 10%? All the way, well, I can't see because I got the screen with everybody's face on it.
Can you magnify, can you increase the, there we go, zoom in on that.
That's better.
Yeah, it's not
Be
easy
a little-
to read.
Yeah. Can you see here this?
Federal
9.9?
funds have been declining for quite a few years, though,
Yeah,
especially now under the current administration.
yeah, and if you go down here, it's there where Jordan has that. And we're going to see that continue to decline, I'm sure. And so
That's a 9.9% drop over what period, Rick?
well, you can go back to, I think that's comparing from 2020 to 2021.
Okay, year on year. Okay.
We're talking about year to year there.
Yep.
And, and monies are coming down more in block form now, not designed specifically for Title I, Title II, as Mary is very familiar with.
There've been a lot of fluctuations.
Yeah.
And they've eliminated a lot of the federal funds and
Yes.
just put them together, as you said.
So then it's up more or less to our DOE to figure out, okay, how are we going to use these block monies?
Well, they have to write an application,
Yeah.
a plan. And usually there's a lot of guidance from the DOE, US DOE.
Yeah. I don't think there's a lot else to gain from that sheet other than just to see that Fed money is not, not increasing, it's doing the reverse.
Well, one thing we do need to consider though with federal money, in 2008, when we had the ARA money, we ran into the same situation, and John probably remembers well. We didn't have funds to meet the adequacy. And at that point in time, we used ARA money to make, meet our constitutionally required obligation. Isn't that, am I right on that, John?
You're right. Back in the last fiscal crisis, the main source of cash stimulus to state governments was out of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and it was a pool of money known as the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. And there were strings attached to the use of that money. And one of the strings was basically holding harmless the state's primary ed funding commitment. So we basically drove federal dollars into the Education Trust Fund to supplant the revenue mix that the prior slide showed, and that freed up those dollars to spend on general fund uses. And I could envision something like that happening again in fiscal 21. I'm not sure the current administration has the same commitment to public education that the Obama administration did, but it is one way to prop up local governments through direct aid to state governments. And I think it worked pretty well nationwide last time around.
It had saved us.
So, so Rick, on this spreadsheet here, so the total statewide gross revenue from federal sources for public education or to the DOE is down 9.9%.
For the elementary, secondary education aspects, but within.
Yeah, that's what I meant. That's what I meant.
Special education and career technical education and vocational education, adult education, those line items are up from 2020 to 21.
So I did want, that's what I wanted to do on this, is just sort of look at this there. And I'm sorry, we can't get this all on one screen, but right above where we were at that 9.9% drop, a few lines above that, there were a bunch of 100% drops. So programs being eliminated.
Yeah, they're being gelled into a block grant.
Okay.
So, but some of them have been left alone because of what they are: adult education, vocational, career tech. Yep. And those are receiving additional dollars.
Mm-hmm.
CT went up this year.
Say that again, Mary.
The career and technical education funding. Yeah. And they're talking about another increase. So I don't know what's going to happen with what's going on now, though.
Okay.
And I don't object to that, because our career technical education centers are needing that as well.
I agree. They used to get a lot more money.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the industries they serve too, right. Need those trained. You need a trained workforce. So is there a line in here, Rick, where all this 100% elimination gets put into a block grant?
Well, you can see up top, where's the block grant stuff up top?
There must be a line that has a positive 100%. No, I mean something new that's created.
No, they just put it into ESEA in a different.
That's right. That's all they've done.
Right.
Okay.
And
There's
they actually eliminated some programs. Title II, they reduced a lot, and what you can do with it is changed a lot, which has made a big difference in local school districts.
Mhm.
And Title IV,
Hi, everybody.
Okay. Hey, Chris, welcome. Um, uh,
and Chris knows this stuff inside out.
Yeah, so it's our population changes that are why we're reducing these. It's not that it's necessarily reduced at the federal level. It's actually increased at the federal level.
Well, some of it, like our preschool education, like it's like UNH got this huge grant. What is it? $26.8 million for preschool education, which is wonderful. But that's through the Health and Human Services. It's not through education.
Well, at the federal level, it's actually a combined effort, but it's administered currently by Health and Human Services. The last round of it was administered by the Department of Ed.
Yeah, I was looking at the source. The source comes from HHS and the administration is through DOE. I agree.
Okay. How much of what's on this sheet needs also to be considered by Jake Centercon and when it comes to looking at adequacy?
The federal, in relation to what we raise locally and through the state, is basically minimal. It's not minimal, but it's small.
And you can't supplant with these funds.
Right.
That's right.
Well, statewide, I think, what we saw on Monday was that it was a little over 5% is federal funds statewide.
Yeah, I've heard 6%, 5%. Yeah.
Well, I think it came out at 5.1%. We were just looking at it yesterday.
Okay.
But another thing, and we all continue to say it, and we'll continue to remind ourselves of it, is that state average is not, no district is state average.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay, so Rick, where do you want to go next?
Well, that's the Fed stuff. I'm looking at the sheets.
Well, John had mentioned another sheet that showed the flows. So, the first sheet we looked at was sort of all state revenue sources for all state budget, for all, state purposes. And there was another sheet that you had that had the flows into the education trust fund from state revenue sources.
Dave, this is Dick again. I suggest that you go to the sheets that I sent in, because the sheet that you're talking about, which shows the flows, is one half. I paired it with the years that go back to 2000. So two sheets. This is it.
No,
and when we talk about flows, we've got to look at more than 20 and 21, obviously.
Right.
So that's essentially the conversation we're getting into. So let's look at these sheets. These are very good sheets from the CAFR.
Yeah.
Go down to the bottom.
And down at the bottom, it shows the movement of general funds.
What that's showing you is in every year except for, well, no, I would say, geez, I can't read across this, but
18.
In the first year, the Ed Trust Fund sent money to the general fund, and then every year, I can't see the headers, but you have 124 million in the first year down to 53 million. That's money being transferred from the general fund to make whole the education trust fund at the end of the year. And then in 18 and 19, it looks like the legislature directed the Ed Trust Fund to hold on to that revenue, and the transfer did not happen. And that I know in certain years that's been like a House Bill 2 entry to kind of clean up the flow of funds between the two, or alter it from what the statute says. But the statute basically says that, as I recall it, the Education Trust Fund retains anything that's left over. But if it's short, the general fund bails it out. And that's sort of to the point of the continuous appropriation. It doesn't so much matter if we put $1 in the Education Trust Fund or $1 billion. The expense is going to get paid, and the general fund is going to make it whole at the end of the year, because it's a constitutional requirement. This all goes back to when the Ed Trust Fund was set up back in 2000, plus or minus. You know, you can't make it a discretionary expense. You know, by setting it up in statute instead of in the budget, it becomes a permanent, ongoing commitment. And I think if you talk to Ann Edwards, who was the DOJ attorney who handled this for a long time, and I kind of wish we had heard from when we did hear from DOJ, because she's generally very, very candid in a way that we did not receive this time. You know, she can talk about, she's got the institutional history to talk about why was the Education Trust Fund set up the way it was.
Who, what's the name, John?
Ann Edwards.
Okay.
She's now, I believe, an associate AG, but she's been at DOJ for, I want to say, 30 years, and she's a fantastic attorney, and she's litigated ed funding from the state's perspective for a long time.
Okay, I'll see what we can. I'll talk with Jordan and Bruce. See what we can do about inviting her.
Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, she's testified at the Education Committee numerous times and was a regular customer for a while there.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is DOJ now has a Solicitor General to deal with all this appellate stuff, and that's who we got. But I don't know Mr. Will, and I know by reputation he's a fine attorney, but I know he doesn't have the institutional knowledge of the legal issues that Ann Edwards does. I don't think there's an attorney in the state who does.
Okay. Okay. Oh, this
I
is
agree.
great. All right, super. Well, Jordan, can you make a note of that?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
But I want to add just one other piece to this discussion of the obligation of the state to fund adequate education when the budget comes up. It's happened before, and it can happen again, that in considering the money that's available during the budget process, the legislature, the finance committee to start with, will determine for good or bad reasons that there's not enough money to meet the formula, and then put into the House Bill 2 the language that changes the obligation. And so statutory change can happen, and there will still be a gloss to that says this change conforms to our constitutional obligations. So the bridge to the Constitution is taken care of. And in I think it was 2012. Let's see, is that a budget year? 2011. The formula was changed. I think it was changed outside the budget, but in late June by a statutory amendment that that moved the determination of differentiated aid to a different place, and led to amounts that were different, not much different because they put in hold harmless provisions, but basically changed the state's so-called constitutional obligation with that statutory change.
Yeah, that was 2011, Dick.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Good. So if we go back up to the top of this, and Rick,
Yeah.
I think this this report was something that both you and Dick had cited in the tasks, but one of the things specific to task 1 was all current revenue sources, and so this is specific to state revenue sources that get used for education. Is that correct?
I'm looking at the other
Yeah,
sheet.
if Jordan scrolls this up to the top, you'll see the heading
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
on the left. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is the history of ed funding, adequacy funding going back to 2010.
Right.
But you've also got, you know, catastrophic aid and tuition and transportation aid. There was dropout prevention money for a while.
That is, I think, isn't that down in the lower part of this document?
Nope. So if you look at, for example, property
Yeah, we're
tax.
missing some. That's right.
Yep. So these are just the expenses that come out of the education trust fund. So Jordan, can you scroll up and then back down? I just want to see what years, which way this thing goes. Okay, 2019. Okay, go back down. So the first column is 2019. So in 2019, we had $1,020 million in resources. We spent $548 million on grants. School districts kept $363 million in property tax as a credit towards the state's adequacy obligation. Adequacy totaled $912 million. And then further out of the Ed Trust Fund, property tax relief is the so-called low and moderate income homeowners property tax relief. Basically, DRA sends certain taxpayers a check in the mail to reimburse them for property tax expense from, it's either 1 or 2 years prior. I want to say it's 2 years prior because there's an application process. Taxpayers already paid the property tax. This program, I believe, started back when we had a $6.60 rate back in 2000, and it was sort of a, you know, a political quid pro quo to get a statewide property tax, a way to bail out super low income folks. Then we're paying for charter school aid. Anybody who says charter schools don't pull money away from traditional public schools can look at this sheet. $4 million in the first year, $36 million this year. And then there's a kindergarten program. I'm not sure what that is. You've got total appropriations, lapses, net appropriations. You know, that's the way to read that statement.
Yeah, and I think the other sheet takes us back to 2000. This is just back to 2012, I think. And that will show the higher numbers for the early years of SWEPT.
So Dick, each of the CAFRs will show a decade history.
That's right. That's right. So I sent a sheet from the, I don't know whether it's 212 or 210 CAFR to pick up the rest of the years. And I think Jordan can put that up easily. Yeah, so look there and scroll over a little bit, Jordan. All the way over. So we see 2000.
So that shows the change.
No, that's your 10.
It was the 2005 legislature that enacted that $363 million number. And
Right.
I can guarantee you that's Ted Gatz's.
I think I guess I didn't get the 2002 and 2001 numbers, but they're certainly available.
So the number that Jordan has highlighted there, 2006, that was the shift from fixed dollars as opposed to fixed rate.
Yeah, I believe so. It was the 2005 legislative session implemented that for fiscal 2006, which began in 7/1/2005.
Okay.
Right.
And the
And
legislature in the prior years had adjusted the rate downward. So if you look at like a history, it goes from like 660. And I think what happened was property values were going up. So they brought the rate down to kind of to bring down how much the state was raising.
Mhm.
What caused the BET to go down from 2006 to 2012?
Where are we?
The great financial crisis,
Yeah.
the last recession.
Yeah.
So when the Education Trust Fund was set up, the legislature passed increases to the BPT and the BET. So the BET used to be, I think the BET started at like 0.25%, then was increased to 0.5. And I want to say it was the 1999 legislature that increased it to 0.75 and directed incremental revenue to the Ed Trust Fund. And it also, I want to say, I think they increased the meals and rooms tax. I think that's when car rentals were added. The tobacco settlement went down right around that same time. So all that money got put in the Ed Trust Fund. The utility property tax was established just to fund the Ed Trust Fund. That all goes back to like 99, 2000.
Right.
So the same thing then, like the real estate tax, that's also dealing with the recession, dropping so significantly there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to ask on this is when we look back at the work on school funding that Senator Estabrook did in, was it 2008?
Yeah.
2008.
2007.
2007. When did the work of when did that effort affect I guess the fiscal year additions?
The
I think it
report,
would have been
What fiscal year was affected
fiscal
by?
year 10 or 9. I'm not sure though.
yeah, the report was written in November 2008. So it had to be out, I would say around 10.
Go down a little bit.
Yeah, I think fiscal year 11 was the first time and the last time that formula was actually applied.
So budget years are
You've got the impact of that federal stimulus money in here. See where that's going to confuse this further, because see where the grant goes, or the subtotal. See the line says total grants goes down from 890 to 700. Pretty sure that's federal. We didn't just spend 700. We've never spent just 700 million on adequacy. This is just a function of how the comptroller's office is reporting this fund. There's more federal spending on adequacy. We never spent just 700 million on adequacy. That never happened.
I don't even know how to read that, I guess.
This is showing state money in and state money out.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at like the DOE website, which just has money spent agnostic to how it's funded, like just the spreadsheets.
Mhm.
I think you'll see a big jump in 2009 or 2010 from that adequacy.
I think it was 200 million we got from ARA.
Okay. And let's see, you know, right around that same time was when the state made a change in the employer retirement system subsidy. 35% to 25% to 0. It was something like that.
Yeah.
That's right. John Lynch brought it down to 15%. And then when Bill O'Brien came on board, they eliminated it altogether.
Right. And I guess a question that we had yesterday was, was any of that subsidy money reflected in transfers out of the education trust fund, or was that done on some other bookkeeping thing somewhere else?
That was a totally general fund expenditure. And I believe that was budgeted for in the Treasury's budget, state Treasurer's budget, and it was supported 100% by the general fund. It was never, that subsidy never came out of the ed trust fund.
Okay, and it never went through school districts. It went directly to the retirement system. Is that right?
That's right. It was the state making direct payment to the retirement system that had a direct proportional impact on the town's bill. So if, you know, Manchester has 300 firefighters, their salary, full-time firefighters, the employer cost of retirement was subsidized. If Haverhill has a volunteer fire department, they didn't benefit from that because their firefighters weren't in the retirement system.
Right. So, but as far as school budgets were concerned, it wasn't a loss of revenue and then a shifting of expense from you know, a state source to a local source. It was actually an increase in expense at the school district level when they basically had to assume that additional 15 to 25 or 35% increase in retirement system.
Exactly.
Manchester.
Right. Okay. Okay. Rick, is there? Yeah, go ahead, John. Sorry.
As we're talking about this, Dave, it kind of reminds me of a thought I've had all along, which is if we're gonna engineer a sea change to how the state funds adequacy, pays for it, distributes it, I would advocate to throw into the mix every stream of local aid. Every, you know, whether, you know, municipal association won't like hearing this, but I would say, you know, throw it all in the mix. And ask the question, how are we as a state supporting local governments? And, you know, who are the winners and losers based on how we do it now? And I know the local government lobby is fractured. You got the school lobby and you got the town lobby. You know, I would say as a taxpayer, I don't really care which pocket it's going into. I want it done correctly and sustainably and predictably and equitably. So, you know, we spend, I don't know how much now, 70 million, 75 million in meals and rooms aid. You know, that's basically a per capita distribution. Rye gets as much as Franklin on a per capita basis. You know, why are we doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Because we always have. But is that the best way for the state to support the outcomes it wants to see at the local level? I would say the state's priority is ed funding. So let's fund that the way it should be done and worry about distributing per capita grants to wealthy communities later.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. John, that's a really good point. I think that goes into you know, something that Bill Ardinger brings up a lot too, the horizontal resource replication. Yeah.
I throw it all in the same bucket, local aid. You know, it's people think about it at the federal level too. It's transfer of cash to where, You know, states are getting money somehow, but how the federal government determines or chooses to direct that money matters a lot to outcomes. And that,
Mhm.
you know, you could say the same at the state level.
Yeah, yeah.
So in one level, we're spending all this time thinking about how we're going to fund education adequacy and do it equitably. And over on this side, we're giving cash grants to Rye. I'm sorry, I'm just picking on Rye because it's easy, but to pave their roads and to subsidize their local government. You know, we've got highway block grants coming out of, you know, that's constitutionally restricted. That's not necessarily a good idea to mess with, but, you know, we've got money coming out of this pocket to build their roads and just direct cash subsidies. That's the meals and rentals aid. I would say we shouldn't ignore that in this conversation.
Mhm. Right, right. And go ahead, Mary, or who?
Chris,
Oh, Chris, yeah, sorry.
I think talking about the rooms and meals is really interesting because I've been long on the lobbying aspect as the, you know, as the community that generates 30% of Rockingham County's rooms and meals, which then generates most of the state's rooms and meals, and you only get back what you have for population. I think the people who've been advocating for a fair share of rooms and meals based on generation would actually be very interested and comfortable with this notion of a different way of distributing rooms and meals, which would actually go to need, because we know we're never going to get back anything like what we generate, right? And I think it's a really interesting way to think about some of these trade-offs that are built into how we currently handle revenues.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in on this. I think it's venturing into territory that we've got a difficult task on our hands already. If we get into allocations of other revenues to cities and towns, even as we try to show that it's all one big picture and we've got to work within that big picture, gets us into territory that it's just more than we can chew on. We've got a challenge. The challenge is to make recommendations related to the funding of education. I think we should stay right on track and not go down these other pathways, other than perhaps to note that there's pressure from the meals and rooms taxpayers to peel off a piece of it related to how much they're generating. And that's pressure has been around a long time, and it is an issue, a category that certainly relates to the donor town argument. And maybe that becomes part of that discussion. But other than that, I don't see going down this pathway.
So,
That's interesting, Representative Ames. I'm surprised to hear you say that because I know you're fond of bold policy proposals. I guess I take the point of view that we're going to make people very angry one way or the other with this. You know, what's another group being angry at us?
Just trying to succeed, I guess.
I think Dick's right. He's trying to be realistic. We want to have a report that's going to sell.
But we don't have that many sources of revenue.
right, and so from a practical standpoint, I agree with what Dick's saying here, and you know our commission has a specific charge too, but I think you know when we sort of swing back to what we talked about at the you know as this meeting was getting started this morning, when looking at the volatility or stability of certain revenue sources, what we report out on and perhaps recommend may take that into consideration, but if there's other things that sort of pull away from or work against us in that, such as how the state's distributing other other things, we may want to make notes of that, because ultimately, we want to make sure that as many of the revenue sources that we rely on for certainly for constitutional services like education are going to be reliable, predictable, stable, independent of economic conditions, or as much as to whatever degree that's possible. So, Dick, I think you're muted.
I'd like to know why my computer seems to send an echo to others at some point, but in any event,
It's the location of the speakers and the microphone on your computer.
On the computer?
Yeah.
So that sounds hopeless.
You could, well, it's not necessarily. You could turn the speakers down, or you could also use like a Bluetooth or even a plug-in headset.
I see.
And that would cut it. That would probably solve the problem.
Okay, thanks for the technical advice.
Jordan, am I up on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wear headphones, so that
Okay.
I don't get that on mine.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was just going to suggest, Dave, that we go to another chart. Let me say this more broadly. One of the items that I sent in, I didn't notice whether Jordan had put it up, but it's Doug Hall's data set in Excel form that gives us much of the information we're looking at here and then some over the years from, way back.
Yeah.
Going
so
forward.
Let's see if we can get that. So now we're sort of blending over to task 2, because there's definitely some overlap in 1 and 2 here.
What I want to say here is that that this data set, you should look at it. Each of us should be looking at it. It has tabs on it. It has data like this, and then it has summary data that shows with pie charts and bar charts different parts of the data. And I think if you go to the bar chart, that's called it's a bar chart, School District Revenue by Source, 1997 through 2019, that gives an overview that we've been talking about in a way through this whole discussion, but I think it would be helpful to look at it if Jordan could put that up. That's not it.
No, it's the bar
chart.
Sorry.
I think it's the one we were looking at yesterday, right?
Yeah, it says bar chart.
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Now look
Sorry,
way
a lot of
over to the
tabs.
left. Way over to the left, you see 1997 to 1998. That's before Claremont. And look at the dark blue at the bottom. That's the local property tax. So that's about all the schools had. A little bit of this, a little bit of that after that. And then there was a significant change in 1999 to 2000. That's when I think the first iteration of SWEPT, SWEPT came in, and also the foundation or adequacy aid kicked in because of those increases that John Beardmore was pointing us to in BET and BBT and other tax, utility, property tax, and so forth. And then you see the federal money, more or less constant, growing. The bar is pretty small here, but growing to its highest level in 2009 to 10, or maybe 2012 to 13, and then gradually diminishing, although it looks like it's up a little bit in 18 to 19. And the foundation adequacy aid pretty much reaching a plateau in 2008 to 09 and carrying forward from there. So I think that's what we can learn from this broad depiction. Federal aid has been pretty constant, within 1% or 2. There are numbers elsewhere in other charts, but within 1% or 2. and SWEP settled down into a constant number. And the local property tax has been creeping up as a percentage of the revenue that school districts receive. And creeping up is almost, it's more than doubled since maybe tripled since 1999 to 2000 as a share of the total.
You know, it's interesting, Dick, when you look at like the 1999-2000 and the proportion between the local property tax and swept is nearly, I mean, it looks like a little more local, but you know, nearly 50-50. And that was when swept was at 660 maybe?
Yeah, it is.
And how that's changed, yeah.
Yeah, really. So, food for thought. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I just want to get out for the record here, Jordan. What's we have this spreadsheet is on the commission website.
Yes, it is. It is. If you go down to the June 5th fiscal policy work group, it is called History of Revenue / Spending for Schools, and it's an Excel file.
Okay, great. So I wanted to make sure all the members and attendees know where they can find this. So and of course, all the other things we're looking at.
And then it's also, this same bar chart is in a 3-page PDF that I think is also on the website that I sent in. So I included this bar chart and a table that summarized some of Doug's data and added some of my own that you might put up, Jordan.
So
this is from my set PDF.
yes.
Yeah, 1 to 3. There you go.
Yep.
There's the table. So I picked because there's so many years involved. I picked 7 or 8 years, and showed the numbers by each of the categories. So you can see the changes, and then down below, I gave you some percentages. Too far. Wait a minute. Where have we gone? Go back to that. Yeah.
Okay.
So in 1998 to 99, as we've seen, the property tax, the local property tax, because there was no swept then, was 81.5% of all revenues. And then it went down, and here we're combining swept with local because it's looking at property taxes, 63% of the total in 2001. And then it moves back up, combining swept and the local property tax to 73%. Federal aid, the next number down, as I said when I was speaking about the other bar chart, sort of has moved up as high as 7%, which I guess is a big move up from 4%, but it's still a very low percentage of the total, and has been moving down. And maybe from Rick's numbers, we can get a sense that it's still moving down. I don't know. And then I added a little context. I think it's really important to keep this in mind. The number of pupils that we're serving with this money statewide has gone down by a lot statewide. And that's another point I want to highlight, that statewide data obscures differences from locality to locality. So there are places that have actually experienced an increase in the number of pupils, sort of down in the Rockingham, in that area. Hopkinton, yeah. And the total, and given that decline and given the increase in money that's flowing into education, would be expected, and is shown here in the numbers, that the revenues per pupil have gone up significantly. And that number in turn disguises great differences, which this commission is all about. We're really, one of our purposes is to look at those differences from locality to locality and other characteristics of those districts, including pupil characteristics, but also economic characteristics, and think about why the differences and what changes ought to be made. I think I had some other things I was going to say, but I can't think of them right now. Yeah.
Okay. No, this is a good spreadsheet. Thanks, Dick.
There's another chart that we might as well look at it. I don't think it really tells us anything. You can show it, Jordan. It's the third sheet on what I said. Yeah. This was done by Doug Hall. All of this data, thanks to Doug Hall. Thanks a million to Doug Hall. He's done heroic work over the years. I don't know how he's done it, but he's accumulated a great deal of data, and he's got the skills to put it into this kind of format that allows you to see it. I know what I was going to say about those per pupil costs. The other thing on the other page, but you don't have to change, is that missing from that data, we learned when we were talking about it yesterday, and it came up again, I think John Beardmore pointed it out, is the indirect cost factor, the retirement benefit change in the mid 2000s. I think that's when it was, late 2000s. That turns out to not be a revenue change, but a change in cost from the school district's perspective, although you could characterize it as an indirect revenue source for the school districts that reduce their expenditures. Somehow we've got to figure out how to pick that one up, because it explains part of the increase in cost at the school district level, and show where that blip first occurred. I think that's important. That's a lot of money. And the other thing,
I think that was right. I think that was right around the 2010 time frame. And
yeah, I actually wrote it down. Let's see. Yeah. What happened with that state contribution to the retirement costs? It had been at 35% in 2016, in 2010, I'm sorry. What am I saying? In 2009. And then it started dropping down to 30%, to 25%, then to $3.5 million. Somehow that became the number, and then to zero. And for the school districts, I don't know the number. The total number for municipalities and school districts in 2009 was $88 million. Maybe it's $40 million. Dave, that's what you said yesterday. I don't know.
Yeah. So I mean, I think I heard the 40 million come from the municipal association back when we were. What was the bill number? House Bill 686. I don't remember the bill number, but it was the cap gain sum bill.
Oh yeah, 686
5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but I think I heard him testify on that. But anyway, though, it's too bad that it was accounted for that way, or that it had never been accounted as an expense on the school district books, because what it looks like is a $40 million increase or 80, whatever that increase statewide is on school district spending, where it was actually something that was being done by the, provided by the state on behalf of school districts, but directly to the retirement system. And are we aware of any other things that are being provided by the state on behalf of school districts that's being done that same way? Rick, do you know of anything? You're muted again.
I don't know of any here right off. I'm trying. I was going from special ed to building aid to everything else now.
Okay. That may be something we want to. I don't know where we chase it down, but either talk with the department about, or just to make sure that there's no other, sort of strange things that are looming that are being done on behalf of districts by the state right now. So, but this is a very telling chart though here, Dick. And so where we are today at, if we look at the swept, basically, and just sort of bring that in as opposed to considering it a state revenue, just look at it how it's being done. But basically the state, what this is saying is currently the state's doing about 20% of school district revenue. The federal government, I think from the last thing, was about 5.1%. So there's about 25% from state and federal sources and 75% coming from local sources. Is that what this is saying?
I got to unmute myself. Hold on.
No,
Yeah, I am unmuted. Well, yeah, I think so. Just keeping.
Dick?
In mind what John Dearmore said, and to say this property taxes that are paying for that what is it? It would be the local plus the swept.
Right.
It just seems so unfair that swept fund, the rest of the state, we have to make up the difference to get to that point because those districts get to keep that money.
Yeah, that's another factor, obviously. I think Dave said he was going to try to have a swept day, and I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I want to keep discussion of that until after we've heard from taken in evidence from from people that can talk about what's happened during the the start of swept through today. So
the other thing I want to say, Dave, is on the other state aid line on that previous sheet that we were looking at, the table sheet, that one. Yes, that one. There's an other state aid line there. And I believe that includes the, what unfortunately has been labeled in the past as catastrophic special aid, special education aid.
mm-hmm.
And I believe that is also where the school building aid is embedded, but that's something that needs to be teased out.
In that other aid line?
I don't know where else it could be, Dave.
Okay. And where did this data come from?
This is Doug's.
Okay.
Doug Hall's, the top 8 or 9 lines are Doug's. The bottom summary stuff, the percentages are mine.
That looks about right, just by eyeballing it, because if you look back at like 2010 timeframe, building aid was like 50 million,
Yeah.
so-called catastrophic, I want to say like 30 million. And then
When
like,
I was deputy commissioner, it was around 85 million.
no, 1 year.
I think, John, it was much higher. Well, quite frankly, that was when I was deputy, when I had to cut our budget significantly, cat aid and building aid, sadly, were the two areas that I'd have to go to because we just didn't have any other money to cut from.
I don't think it was ever 85 million.
I don't think it was ever that high.
No.
I don't know. I seem to remember that it was, but I may be wrong. That's a long time ago.
Okay. Well, I'll email Doug and ask him how that line breaks out. So
It may be in his spreadsheet,
yeah.
Dave.
I'm going to find it right now.
Okay. All right, Dick, where do you want to go next with
Well, I have one other sheet I guess I would like to look at that I sent in separately, Jordan. Yep.
Which one is it, Dick?
It's called New Hampshire School Funding Noteworthy Data Points.
You have that, Jordan?
Yep, let me just pull it up. It's a Word doc, I think.
Great. Yep.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
There we go.
Okay, this is something that I put together, and my purpose in doing this is to keep us keep very much at the front of our review of all of this, the wide variance that occurs as you go down to the school and school district level from the state level. And I didn't do that with the first number, which is the statewide number. We've already talked about that. Just bear that in mind. And I didn't do it with the second number either, but we've talked about that too a little bit, I think. Yeah, we have talked about that. So look at the third bullet, and you've got the school district, and now we're talking, because that's the way the data can be accessed. We're talking about cost per elementary school. And I've done it per elementary school pupil. So that's where I find the best data. And the state average there is 17,400. This is leaving out bonding and some other costs, I think school buildings. The median is lower.
Hey, was that Chris or Mary?
Yeah. I was going to say, I think it's really helpful to look at this. I think it would be extremely helpful to look at this by classes of size of school, because it's easy for people to think that that range is high because of, lavishing things on pupils. Sometimes it's high because you're operating such a small school. So I think it would be extremely useful to do some of these breakouts that way. And also, we tend to do these things by school district. And that often works because we have single elementary school districts. But when you get into larger districts, doing this by school is also very telling.
Yeah. I would second all of that. That's really why I put this down as a range, as a starting point to dig in. You have to, of course, dig into it to see the various ways in which these obviously huge differences can be explained and understood, and maybe in some cases addressed as problematic.
So is that something we want to take a look at as part of this task then, to look at the cost per elementary school student and sort of break things down into I don't know, small, medium, large, schools, and also districts.
That might be something that we get information from AIR on. When they did that over in Vermont, they brought in some differentiated aid or weighted factor for size of school and student. What is the definition of an elementary school? Is it K through 4, K through 3, K through 8? Some schools.
It's whatever the DOE uses for its data set. I think it's K through 5, but I don't know.
And then what about for small, medium, large? Is there a standard?
Well, see, up here, our middle school is grades 4 through 8. And so it's different. Every district, that's part of our problem we're dealing with. Our structure or organization in this state is so convoluted because of the small nature of towns and communities and the culture of those towns and communities. It's amazing.
Okay, maybe I should go down, if I may, Dave, through the rest of this, just the adequacy aid per pupil. The current formula as funded to provide, it was the formula. I'm focusing on the formula here, not about any hold harmless aspects of it. So the current formula average, the base is 3,709, and the differentiated aid statewide comes out to 910 per pupil, so that the total average, again, watch out for averages, is 4619 per pupil. The range of the combined base and differentiated aid, given the current formula, runs from and this is by district, 3,709 for several districts. So those districts are getting essentially nothing extra, to 5,261. And Northumberland was, I think it was next to highest, is an example of that, where there are significant numbers of free and reduced price kids and special ed kids. So that gives you a sense of what the current formula's potential is in sort of differentiating between school districts based on some calculation of relative need. I also looked at the 2008 formula, the outgrowth of that 2007 commission. And it was, I had that formula in the bill that I put forward last year, HB 597. I think Dave may have been a co-sponsor, maybe not. But in that formula, because who am I to change the base? I just used the base brought forward to account for CPA adjustments. But in this case, for your use, I've used the same base that's in the current formula, 3,709. But then I put on the differentiated aid calculations that were in that bill and that were in the 2008 formula. So basically, this is the 2008 formula with CPA adjustments. And there, if you look to the average statewide, you get 5,809.14. But if you look at the range, which is the interesting feature, you have a low of 3,709. Again, some districts with essentially no extra aid, moving up all the way to 7,874. So more than doubling with the use of differentiated aid. And my sole point in putting this out is that historically we have formulas have been put in place. This one didn't last very long, to dramatically change the distribution of revenue based on a perception of relative need. And so I just wanted to get that out there. Mm-hmm. That's part of our history.
Mm-hmm. So, Dick, thanks for doing that. Something that I think we'd talked about this work group doing was also, and I think it might maybe it could be reflected in the in a version of that bar chart that we looked at earlier from Doug Hall's data and your report, Dick, that showed the mix of revenue sources to school districts over a period of 20 years. And maybe if that could be, and I think you're sort of getting to it with this, if you took a look at a snapshot of how things were when the 2008 funding formula came into effect. So what did we say that was FY10?
FY11, I think. So
let's.
It could have been 10. No, I think 11 was when it first was fully funded.
Yeah, because don't we? Well, FY11. So that would be the second year of a.
Yeah. I think so. I'm not sure of that.
Okay. Well, let's. We can. That's probably a question. Probably ask the LBA. Dick?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. So to find out when that, but anyway, take whatever the percentage mix was in that year, whether it's FY10, FY11, and apply that to the years going forward, but most importantly to sort of like FY19, and so if the formula had sort of stayed the way it if the percentages had remained fixed, what would it look like now? Is that something we want to do?
I think that's good. That's essentially what I think I did.
Yeah.
I have a spreadsheet with the formulas built into it, so that the fact that today I use Northumberland because it comes to mind. Yeah. Has a different percentage of free and reduced price lunch kids, or a different number. This percentage too. Yeah. Is factored into the result. It's not just a change in CPI. Mm-hmm. It's a change in the numbers of kids with different needs.
Right. Okay. All right. Where are we at right now? Is there anything else you want to talk about, Dick, with respect to task 2? For the moment?
Let's see. Yeah, I just mentioned this too. On the property tax, we talk about statewide 73.3%, including swept of all costs. That there is a range again, and Franklin was the subject of one of Doug Hall's in-depth reports, and Franklin turns out to have, according to that report, 30% of his revenue coming from the property tax. I guess that's not too surprising since they've got a property tax cap, and it's placed a lid on how much is going to come from the property tax, and then it's not too surprising because they probably have more federal aid. In fact, I think they've got 15%, that's on memory, versus 5% statewide federal money. So the other point is the federal money too ranges, and Title I can be, I suspect, a big part of the explanation, or special ed funding from the federal government could be a part of that explanation. So we have to keep in mind that there's a lot of variation
right.
At the local level.
At the local level, so taking the cities of Franklin and I think Manchester too. Does Manchester have a property tax?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. And how does that read when it comes to like swept?
Well, we don't have swept.
Swept is separately assessed.
Right. So the property tax cap that that were put in place by Franklin and Manchester is only the local portion of it, not the statewide.
It's
Not
the
the
local
state.
portion, including the municipal,
Right.
let me think. Maybe
Right.
John understands this, or Mary understands this better than I do.
Aren't they effectively budget tax caps and not property tax caps? So that can play out differently too.
That's what I was going to say. I don't think property tax cap is the right terminology, and I can't speak knowledgeably, but they're effectively spending caps, I believe.
Right. That's it exactly, John.
Okay.
And you need to do a budget override. For example, why I worry about the money we're sending to Manchester, they need to do a tax cap override in order to be able to expend those dollars.
Tax cap, you mean a spending cap override?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay, good. We've got about 10, 15 minutes left, and I wanted to, we're not going to get through everything in the agenda. I don't want to start a discussion now on what equitable and fiscal neutrality, that would run over quite a bit. But I do think we could spend a few minutes talking about how what we've learned from tasks 1 and 2 might play into what we need to do in task 3. So task 3 is identify variable impacts on local districts of current funding sources and levels. And do we think we've probably, so let me read it again, identify variable impacts on local districts of current funding sources and levels. Maybe I should ask, what do we think that means?
Yeah. Isn't that what Dick was doing?
Yeah.
Variable impacts on local districts of current funding sources. I think, I mean, I was taking that could factor in, volatility aspects too. That if there's such a reliance on obviously local property taxes right now, and there's such variability in local property taxes across the state. I mean, I don't know. I mean, John, you suggested that typically a municipality sees 98% on time property tax payments, but this year, obviously, that we're not going to be close to that. But would you expect there to be a difference in, let's say, a community that has a tax rate like Claremont or Berlin and maybe other communities?
I wouldn't. First, let me say the 98% collection rate. I look at property tax collection rates nationwide. Usually, we talk about how much is collected in the current year as a percentage of the current year's levy, whether or not it relates to the current year's levy. So like that 98% can include people paying prior year's outstanding property taxes. Just that in any given year, nationwide, as I look at it, 96 to 99% is pretty common. I think you're going to see collection rates drop based more as a function on underlying demographics as you are the rate. But then again, those things might be one and the same, right? You got a pretty high rate in Franklin. Franklin might suffer collection rates. The rates, I'm just going to keep picking on Rye. The rate's pretty low in Rye, but if I'm a betting man, I'd say Rye is still going to get 97% collection rate because this economic downturn is hitting low income people far worse than it is high income people.
How how's that? How's collection rate data? So now we're talking about sort of volatility in the property tax. How is that affected by like you know your the bank that holds your mortgage? You know, collects it through an escrow and then pays your property tax. You know, how's the volatility affected by that?
So the volatility is buffeted by the large share of taxpayers that escrow. And if I've never seen data on this, but I'm willing to bet escrow rates are higher in lower socioeconomic towns than they are in higher socioeconomic towns. Banks usually make you escrow if you have less than 20% equity in your house. And banks are typically don't take advantage of property tax deferral programs. Like I know, for example, right now in the state of Connecticut, the state has mandated towns allow one of two different deferral programs, which is basically just saying taxpayer gets an extra couple months to come up with the cash and not face penalty and interest. But if you've lost your job, but you've already escrowed all your property taxes, your bank's going to kick that money over anyway on time. Right. Usually. The bank's not going to mess around with trying to arbitrage a property tax relief program. They're just going to pay the property taxes.
Right. Okay. All right. So any other thoughts or questions on that? On those points. All right. So looking back at task 3, it sounds like we've got a considerable amount of that done, but do we want to somehow factor in, I think, you know, Dick, you're going to be putting together a spreadsheet of FY 2021 revenues budgeted versus FY 2021 revenues adjusted. And you're muted again.
Yes, we have prepared, Ways and Means has prepared a proposed resolution, which may or may not, depending on how things go, be presented to the full House for adoption, which is the way for a presentation and then it's tabled. That's the way we've always done these resolutions. And that resolution is very clear. It has on it the plan, which is the number we've been working off of, and then the low and the high for each of the taxes. I could put that into a spreadsheet quite easily, I think. So maybe I'll send you a spreadsheet.
That would be great. And is there a way that you can take that low and the high and somehow come up with some sort of volatility, you know, index, at least based on, you know, our current economic conditions?
I don't know. How would you do that? How would you think?
I mean, you know, sort of what was budgeted a year ago versus you know, versus the adjusted or budget, yeah, a year ago.
This is probably a worst case, but yeah.
So, and you know, and just looking at those numbers, it seemed, you know, some numbers were affected differently than others.
Oh, they are. I didn't talk about them, but the lottery is and liquor is you know, not changing, and cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way.
John Hunt used to always say, "Beer is flat."
Beer is flat. Exactly. Yeah. But it's the big ones that have been affected, and those are the ones that we need to keep in mind.
Okay. Okay. All right. Let me just review a couple things. So Dick, you're going to work on that. I'm going to work on scheduling a SWEP day and who we might want to have for speakers for that to take us through the historical context, but also the litigation surrounding SWEP. Before we get into a conversation about it, I think we need to hear from people about it. Going to look into maybe Ann Edwards could play. Would she have some background for that type of a meeting? Mary,
Yeah,
I can't even hear you.
I don't know if Ian Edwards would have the background on SWEPT. I'm not sure. She might. She's really on top of all the education things.
Okay, but I think it would probably make sense to have her come in anyway, and it may be at a full commission meeting too to talk about the ETF and.
David, could I just ask why we haven't had the LBA be part of, Mickey is such a wealth of information. I know we have Jen that is often on our calls, and it just seems that Mickey would have a lot of this information right at hand for us.
Yeah, and I agree with that. There's been no reason why they haven't been, but I've got that on my list as well to contact Mickey and get an answer as to what fiscal year was first affected by the 2008 school funding policy. But I think it's important that. Well, there's two things when it comes to the LBA. There's the spreadsheets and the work that they develop when determining the school funding, the school money that goes into budgets. But I think they're going to be instrumental in helping to craft legislation. I'm not just talking about a single piece, but multiple pieces of legislation that come out of the work we do. So they probably want to. It would probably make sense to get them actively involved in these meetings too. But I'm sure they're actively involved in, like, as everybody is right now. So, but maybe that's a conversation you and I can have with Mickey and with Michael. So.
I think, Dave, in terms of follow-up,
Yeah.
the retirement fund blip and nailing down how that what exactly that was for the school districts.
Yep.
That's some follow-up that is necessary, and also the other state aid category, breaking that out.
Yep.
And on on that one point that I don't think I mentioned, or it wasn't mentioned, for the catastrophic aid, the special education aid, it's typically, there's an entitlement, there's a formula in the statute. It depends on what actually happens in terms of numbers of special ed kids and what their needs are. But there's a formula that applies to the
3.5 times, the 10 times.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And so historically, I think the norm has been that the state hasn't fully funded that so-called entitlement. And the percent has ranged, and then there's a pro rata payment to each school district. So I think if we could piece that, be able to show the entitlement as well as the actual a year, that would be useful.
Remember, that comes in the following year. No school district gets that during the school year. That
lags by a year. But all the more reason why we should already know what that is and be able to budget for that. And so how we were 10% off, $3 million off when budgeting for it this year really has.
I don't understand that either.
Yeah, I mean that should have been budgeted more accurately, and
they should have had those numbers by then.
Right.
And this is all very relevant to our efforts on adequacy because, you know, should this be part of adequacy or not? Catastrophic Special Education Act. After all, it's legally required. That's why a school pays $200,000 for a kid to go to Project Mountain, for example. It's not, oh, maybe I shouldn't say it this way. The school may want it as much as the parents do, but they don't have to do it, except that they have to do it because of the law.
Right,
And
right.
It's legally required.
IEP driven.
Yep. And actually the law is changing on that too, Rick. You and I talked about how important it, you know, one of the important bills, House bills that's in the Senate is aligning New Hampshire law with federal.
Right. On the age,
What's that?
Yeah.
are you talking about the bill with the age through age 21 or?
Yeah, through the completion of age 21.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And
So-
another component of this special education is that we've gone through one hell of a year here dealing with Medicaid. And what type of revenues, you know, that's up close to 30 million bucks.
Yes.
And so that is a revenue source, a stream that schools absolutely depend upon. And we don't have any data here yet to show what do we receive. It's kind of that out in the cloud somewhere because it all generates from HHS and DOE is supposed to administer it. Well, not really. The school district's supposed to administer it.
The school district does.
Yeah, and I've had intermittent discussions with Senator Khan about this. He's been, where did Rick go?
He disappeared. We'll keep looking for him.
Drops through the floor.
Okay, but we actually do have a House bill that's still in the Senate that's directed to Medicaid to schools. It's exactly the same as the Senate bill that we passed, you know, in case anything needs to be amended, because the last I checked in on this a couple of weeks ago, there was, I think there was some back and forth going on with CMS and the state over final rulemaking or something like that. So, but anyway, all right, we're right at the 12 o'clock hour. Thanks everybody for looking at a lot of numbers today. I know my eyes are tired already, but couple things. The public engagement work group that was scheduled for 1 o'clock has been, they decided to cancel. So anybody that's following us, there's not public engagement's not meeting today. Adequacy will meet at 3 o'clock today, and we'll see. I'll be there for that, and hope everybody has a wonderful weekend and busy week next week.
Thank you, Dave.
All right, thanks so much. We're good. Yep.
Bye.
Bye now.